Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's the second half of our reading of Palestine Belongs to Palestinians, a collection of writings from Enver Hoxha spanning the years 1970 to 1983. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So as we stated in the first half of this reading, in reference to the overall global political situation in the 70s, Hoxha makes frequent reference to the concept of social imperialism regarding the USSR. Here on the channel, we recently completed a mini-series titled Sino-Soviet Split, explaining how, after the death of Stalin in the later 50s and early 60s, there was a major political rift between Maoist China and the USSR under Khrushchev. You can listen to that playlist for more of the details, but essentially, China and some other Marxist-Leninist parties considered that the Soviet Union was engaging in great power chauvinism within the international communist movement, and beyond this, that the group around Khrushchev was revisionist, that is, they were anti-Marxist, and that they were preparing the way for the merger of the USSR and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union with the reformist socialist parties of Western Europe, in fact laying the groundwork for the restoration of capitalism, which would in fact occur as a historical fact about 3 decades later. So Hoxha and the Party of Labor of Albania were among those who sided with China, and Hoxha himself contributed a lot of writing and criticism to this general topic. And then later, in the late 70s, when China itself started to liberalize after the death of Mao Zedong, socialist Albania would split with China also. So keeping that in mind, let's begin. September 19, 1977. The enemies of the Arab peoples must be sternly denounced. These were theses for an article, which we'll be reading as the next entry in this collection, about the visit which Anwar al-Sadat is to make shortly to Israel. The aggressors must be isolated, must be exposed and combated. One such aggressor against the freedom, independence, and territorial integrity of the Arab peoples is Israel. It has shed the blood of the fraternal Arab peoples and occupied their territories. Every day, Israel is relentlessly attacking, killing, and massacring such a glorious people as the fraternal Palestinian people, whom the Zionists, supported by the American imperialists, have left without a homeland. Today, the heroic Palestinian people are scattered and living the miserable existence of the homeless given shelter by their Arab brothers. Although fragmented and massacred, this nation has a high awareness of the need to fight and a fine fighting spirit. It has never given up the fight to win its freedom and rights and regain its homeland. The Albanian people nurture a great love, respect, and admiration for this long-suffering but valiant people, and have unshakable confidence in their ultimate victory. To come to terms and reach a compromise with Israel, to neglect and violate the interests of the Arab peoples, especially the interests of the Palestinian and Syrian peoples, deserves condemnation. The Albanian people, as close and faithful friends of the Arab peoples, consider this to be a pro-imperialist activity, which is aimed against the interests of the Arabs, and encourages the imperialist Israeli aggression. All the sound elements amongst the Arab public, the Palestinians, Syrians, Algerians, Iraqis, Libyans, and even the Egyptians, have expressed their opposition to the agreement and compromise with Israel. Likewise, all who are genuine fighters against American imperialism and Soviet social imperialism, against reaction and oppression, all who are for the freedom of the peoples and their liberation struggle, have unequivocally condemned and criticized the surrender to Israel and have taken a clear-cut stand against the compromise with Israel. It is noticeable, however, that the card of the non-aligned is not being played at all. This is not accidental. The concrete events, the development of the class struggle, have brought out clearly the falsity of theories or movements intended to deceive the peoples. What can the partisans of the non-aligned movement say when the protagonists of such compromises, who are also the standard bearers of, quote, non-alignment, display openly that they are committed to and dependent on imperialism, that they are playing its game, that the policy which they pursue is formally independent, but in reality is dictated by others and defends interests alien to the Arab peoples. Comment: so the non-aligned movement was something closely associated with Yugoslavia, with which Hoxha and Albania had a very bad relationship, for good reason, which is explained in part 1 of this audiobook. Also, if you listen to the Sino-Soviet Split playlist, there are a number of pieces in which Hoxha expands on this. Also, coming up right in the next section after this comment is a reference to Dungus Third Worldism. This is a revisionist theory which was emerging at that time. 1977 was right about the time of the Sino-Albanian split, and Third Worldism is still promoted in various guises today. The whole BRICS and multipolarity thing is closely related to it today. It's essentially a very similar idea. Continuing. Likewise, there is no activity apparent from the so-called Third World. The supporters of this theory, who loudly proclaim and try to prove with quotations that they are helping the struggle in the interests of the peoples of the world, are not showing that they defend the just cause of the Arab peoples, not coming out in support of them. Why is this? Can it be that the interests and the territories of the Arabs, the future and the existence of the Palestinians, must be sacrificed for the sake of the alliance with the, quote, Second World and the United States of America? Or perhaps this is required by the supreme interests of imperialist superpowers, which the small nations and ordinary people are quite unable to understand. Our party and the Albanian people scornfully reject all the imperialist calculations. Our people have always supported the just cause of the Arab peoples and will be beside them in any situation, good or bad, in their rejoicings and victories as well as in their griefs and temporary defeats. Ours is a small nation, but it is an unwaveringly loyal brother to those who are fighting for freedom and justice, like the Arabs and the peoples of Africa. November 24, 1977. The Just Cause of the Arab Peoples is Invincible, an article published in the newspaper Zëri I Popullit. In recent days, the problems of the Middle East have become an object of great interest for all international public opinion. The reason for this is the visit which the Egyptian president, Sadat, paid to Jerusalem and the talks which he held with Israeli Prime Minister Begin. Words about peace there are in plenty, but the real and just solution of the problems of the Middle East is not apparent on the horizon. Israel, that armed instrument of the political, economic, and military interests of the American imperialists in the Middle East, is still keeping the Arab territories occupied. The Palestinians are still left without their homeland, and the superpowers are still intriguing and interfering in the internal affairs of the peoples of that zone. Time after time, the enemies of the Arab peoples bring out with great publicity all sorts of plans and projects allegedly to solve the problems which are concerning the Middle East and to put an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict which has been going on for 30 years. A great deal of talk has been heard about these plans, Rogers or Kissinger plans, Gromyko or Vance plans, plans of sheiks and emissaries of the United Nations. But these plans have changed nothing and could not have done so. The aim of all of them has been to quell the liberation struggle of the Arab peoples, to compel them to relinquish their supreme national interests, to abandon the Palestinian people and leave them in the lurch, to capitulate to the blackmail of Israel, and to submit completely and finally to foreign imperialist domination. The Arab peoples are well aware who their enemies are, know that the aggressors must be unmasked, isolated, and fought. They know that Israel is a savage, insatiable aggressor against the Arab peoples, against their freedom and independence. On several occasions, it has shed the blood of the fraternal Arab peoples, has occupied their territories, and has kept them under continual threat of further expansion. Every day, Israel is attacking, maiming, and killing an ancient and glorious people, such as the fraternal Palestinian people, whom the Zionists, with the urging and support of the American imperialists, have left without homes or homeland. In flagrant violation of all historical, international, and human justice, the Palestinian people have been forcibly driven from their homes, from the territories on which they were born and have lived for centuries, where they developed their lofty civilization from which the whole of mankind has benefited. Now they have been dispersed and are living the miserable life of refugees, as guests in the homes of their Arab brothers. Despite their suffering and fragmentation, the Palestinian people have retained all their fighting spirit and lofty national consciousness. They have never laid down their arms in the fight to gain their freedom, their rights, and their homeland. The heroic liberation struggle which the Palestinian people have always been waging will remain throughout history as a great example of those small peoples whom no enemy, however mighty, can intimidate, who, when it comes to defending their freedom and rights, are ready to make any sacrifice, to endure any suffering and hardship, however protracted and stern the fight may be. The Albanian people, who feel a close affinity with the Palestinian people and their struggle, nurture a sincere affection and great respect and admiration for this long-suffering, valiant people, and have unwavering confidence in their final victory. Numerous efforts have been and are being made from various directions to bring about agreement and compromise with Israel. neglecting and violating the vital interests of the Arab peoples, especially the interests of the Palestinian and Syrian peoples. This is to be condemned and cannot be accepted either by the Arab peoples and their true friends, or by anybody to whom the freedom and independence of the peoples is dear. Our people, as close and loyal friends of the Arab peoples, consider these attempts to reach agreement as activity aimed against the interests of the Arabs, as pro-imperialist and further incitement to Israeli aggression. All progressive and patriotic Arab opinion, from the Palestinians, the Syrians, the Algerians, the Iraqis, and the Libyans to the Egyptians, has expressed open opposition to agreement and compromise with Israel. Likewise, all who are genuine fighters against American imperialism and Soviet social imperialism, who are opposed to reaction and oppression, all who are for the freedom of peoples and support their liberation struggle, have criticized and firmly condemned the agreements with Israel, have adopted a clear-cut stand against any compromise with it. Contrary to this widespread healthy opinion, however, it is noticeable that at present the non-aligned forces are playing no role. They're keeping quiet and trying with difficulty to maneuver to get out of the difficult position in which the plan for agreement with Israel is putting them. What has happened to all those speeches and pledges about defending the rights of the Arab peoples and the Palestinians? What has happened to all those resolutions and decisions about the just settlement of the conflict in the Middle East? That opposition expressed from the tribunes of conferences to the imperialist interference in that zone. This silence on the part of those unrestrained lovers of empty talk is not accidental. The things that have occurred, the concrete events, the development of the class struggle have brought to light the falsity of, quote, theories or, quote, movements, which are intended to quell revolutionary and liberation struggles and to deceive the peoples. This falsity is being revealed by the imperialists themselves, who, when it comes to defending their own interests, do not worry at all about the difficult positions in which they place their friends. What can the theoreticians and supporters of the, quote, non-aligned movement say when the standard bearers of non-alignment openly show themselves to be committed to and dependent on imperialism, that they are playing the imperialists' game, that the policy they pursue is independent formally, but in reality is dictated by others, and defends interests alien to the Arab peoples? The, quote, non-aligned movement may still continue to exist in conferences, meetings, and propaganda, but it has been dead since the time when, in the Middle East and the Ogaden Desert, in Angola and Zaire, it proved incapable of hiding the fact that many governments of countries which pose as non-aligned are linked with this or that big capitalist or imperialist power, that on many occasions they play the game of imperialism and defend its neo-colonialist and expansionist interests. Now it is incapable of covering up and justifying the interference, intrigues, and maneuvers of the imperialist superpowers in many, quote, non-aligned countries with empty words, or concealing and justifying the pro-imperialist actions of many heads of these countries against liberation struggles. In connection with the agreement and compromise with Israel, there is no apparent activity of the so-called Third World either. We do not see the supporters of the theory of three worlds who shout so loudly and try to prove with quotations that they unreservedly support the liberation struggles and defend the interests of peoples of the world, defending the just cause of the Arab peoples or coming out in their support. Why is this? Can it be that the interests and territories of the Arabs, the future and existence of the Palestinians, must be sacrificed for the sake of the alliance with the Second World and the United States of America? Or perhaps this is required by the supreme interests of imperialist superpowers, which the small peoples and ordinary folk are quite unable to understand. The very embarrassing position of the supporters of the theory of three worlds, for whom the agreement and compromise with Israel has torn to shreds the scheme which links their, quote, worlds, is understandable. The question is simple. In whose favor is this agreement? In favor of the, quote, first world, the, quote, second, or the, quote, third? Does it serve the liberation of peoples or national oppression, the anti-imperialist struggle, or the quelling of the struggle? Their silence shows that this agreement cannot be used for their propaganda purposes, that in this case, their slogans and, quote, theories are quite unable to alter the nature of the fact. Can the policy of the American imperialists, which defends and supports their most aggressive satellite, Israel, be considered a non-aggressive policy, a retreat? At the present time, aggressive war is being prepared step by step, through minor wars, by inciting separate aggressions and kindling local conflicts. If the American imperialists proclaim that they are allegedly for the status quo, this does not mean that they have given up their aggressive and expansionist aims, but that the status quo serves their hegemonic aims, to the detriment of the Arab peoples and in favor of the imperialist interests of the United States and its ally, Israel. We are against and condemn Carter's efforts to conceal his aggressive policy. Likewise, we are against the presentation of the American policy of the status quo not as aggressive, but as a defensive policy. The teeth of American imperialism have not yet fallen out, nor have its claws been clipped. To defend the policy of the status quo means to defend imperialist occupations, to defend the division of the world between great powers, to defend neocolonialism, the exploitation of oppressed peoples by imperialism and all the other capitalist powers. To defend the status quo means to give your blessing to the occupation of the Arab territories by the Israelis and the violent expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. It means to defend the military bases in foreign countries, the aggressive blocs of imperialism, the multinational monopoly companies, and the whole imperialist system of oppression and exploitation. The Party of Labor of Albania and the Albanian people scornfully reject all the imperialist calculations. Our people have always been and are with the just cause of the Arab peoples and will be beside them in any situation, good or bad, in joys and victories, in grief and in temporary defeats. The Albanians are a small people, but for the peoples who are fighting for freedom and justice, such as the Arab peoples and the peoples of Africa, they are unwavering, loyal brothers. December 10, 1977. The tragedy of the Arab peoples. There are also the Palestinian Arab people and the Israeli people in this region. In the past, there were not many Jews in this region, but with the passage of time, especially after the creation of the State of Israel, their numbers grew fairly considerably. If I'm not mistaken, today Israel has over 3.5 million inhabitants, but the Israeli psychology and inspiration, especially in the field of organization, have led to the strengthening of the state from all standpoints, not only economic and financial, but also military. The main support of the State of Israel is American imperialism, without overlooking the other imperialist states. Apart from Israel, through the big oil monopolies, American imperialism has Saudi Arabia, the country richest in oil in this zone, the Emirates of the Persian Gulf, and Iran under its influence. In practice, American imperialism has the oil fields in all these countries under its control. American imperialism is ready to go to war in order to hold on to this great wealth, but before becoming involved in war itself, it embroils others to fight for its interests. Thus, when it saw a possible threat to its sphere of influence in the Middle East, it spurred on Israel, which launched several successive military attacks on Egypt and Syria, which relied on Soviet social imperialism, allegedly to conquer Israel because it had occupied some of their territories and had driven the Palestinians from their own territories, forcing them to live as refugees in other Arab countries, as they're doing to this day. This was in the interests of the policy of the Soviet social imperialists, because their true aim was to get control of the great oil wealth in the Middle East by means of Egypt and Syria. Nasser fell into the trap of the Soviets. He advocated the total liquidation of Israel, and under a false pretext, established himself in North Yemen. His policy of dependence on the Soviets brought Egypt and its people the damage we know. Anwar al-Sadat followed the policy of Nasser, linked himself more closely with the Soviet Union, and continued to threaten Israel. This enabled the Soviet Union to establish itself firmly in Egypt and brought things to the point in which it thought no one could get it out. Basing himself on the arms he received from the Soviet Union, Sadat carried out a political maneuver with an eye to the future, assessed the Israeli forces in Sinai and attacked them, but without any great success. Nonetheless, the Egyptian armies crossed to the east side of the Suez Canal and entered a part of Sinai, which had been occupied by Israel in Nasser's time. In this situation, the United States of America intervened, and a ceasefire was established through the Security Council. Sadat called the crossing to the east bank of the Suez Canal a great victory of the Yom Kippur War, as this war was called. But Israel, too, played its part in the political game, crossed to the west side of the Suez Canal, accepted the ceasefire, the talks for which were held precisely on that part of the Egyptian territory that was occupied during this war. After the ceasefire, Israel still holds the Egyptian territories in Sinai and other Arab territories it occupied, has the Palestinian forces outside its territory, and is launching continued attacks on their bases, which are situated close to the occupied territories. December 17, 1977. The Middle East question in the light of recent events. During all this period, Begin has been making many trips abroad. He went to France, where he had cordial talks with Giscard d'Estaing, who supports this, quote, peaceful line. Begin also went to West Germany, which likewise supports this peaceful line. In recent days, he went to Washington. Of course, he has been summoned to the American capital by Carter to receive even more precise instructions about what the United States of America wants achieved in these negotiations, and apparently Carter and Begin have reached a satisfactory agreement. Thus, as news agencies report, Begin will go to meet Sadat in Egypt and conclude an agreement with him. What sort of agreement will this be in the present conditions? It is most likely to be a bilateral peace, that is, between Egypt and Israel. And efforts will certainly be made later to get Syria, and perhaps even the other Arab countries which at present are opposed, to accept it. In this case, Sadat may be given the Sinai Desert, and of course, according Israel, many rights confirmed and guaranteed by the United States of America, such as unimpeded free passage for its ships through the Suez Canal to the Red Sea, and through the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden to the Indian Ocean, while the canal will be left completely free or under the management of both parties. On the other hand, this bilateral, quote, peace agreement might also lead to the settlement, quote, in principle of the Palestinian question. This settlement in principle of the Palestinian question will, of course, be to the liking of the Americans and the Israelis, and will be accepted by Sadat. Hence, the aim is that the west bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip on the shores of the Mediterranean be included in a, quote, Palestinian state, or rather not an independent Palestinian state, but an entity just sufficient to acknowledge the existence of the Palestinians, united with the Hashemite kingdom of Hussein. September 22, 1978. 3 politicians and the problems of the Middle East. Despite the innumerable resolutions which have been taken in the United Nations organization against the activities of Israel, despite the fact that the states of the world have raised their voices loudly against it, Israel has continued its aggressive activity. Not only has it occupied Arab territories, but by accepting Jewish immigrants from Poland, Romania, and especially the Soviet Union, as well as from other countries of Europe, it has created Jewish colonies in them. Of all the Arab peoples, the heroic Palestinian people, who for decades on end have borne the greatest burden of misery that mankind has ever seen, are suffering the most. They are living as refugees, sheltering in makeshift homes and tents in the desert because they've lost their homeland, which the Israelis have occupied and refused to give up. Therefore, the Palestinian people have risen in merciless struggle, with no compromise up till now. Notwithstanding that within the Palestine liberation movement there are groups with different views, in general, they all desire the liberation of their country from the Israeli Zionists. The Palestinian people can be found living scattered in all the Arab countries. In Lebanon, where they are established in villages which are fighting centers. In Egypt, where they have lived as refugees and fighters. In Syria, where sometimes they're allowed to fight, sometimes not. They have lived and some still live in Jordan, where they have been barbarously oppressed, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in the Emirates of the Persian Gulf, and even in France and elsewhere. They are a valiant fighting people who have never ceased their resistance for one day. Now, in these difficult and more or less peaceful conditions which the United States of America has created between Egypt and Israel, after many discussions and maneuvers and countless deals behind the scenes, the 3 of them have met at Camp David, allegedly to settle the question of the Middle East. For 13 days, they were engaged in tete-a-tete discussions. Moreover, Jimmy Carter became an active participant in these talks, so that they were held not just between Sadat and Begin, but between Carter, Sadat, and Begin. Thus, Carter was considered a third partner in these talks, allegedly to establish peace in the Middle East. The outcome of all of this, of course, was that the mountain labored and brought forth a mouse. The mouse represents what the Palestinian people and the Arab peoples in general, quote, gained or did not gain. According to the communique, at Camp David, American imperialism managed to, quote, conclude a sort of agreement between Begin's Israel and Sadat's Egypt for a temporary peace, for a temporary settlement covering the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Negev Desert. In reality, nothing concrete was achieved. We can say that all that was settled was that within 5 years, Israel is to partly withdraw from the West Bank of the River Jordan and from Gaza with the alleged aim of establishing there the autonomous state of the Palestinians of these zones. The autonomous Palestinian administration, of course, is, quote, to be guaranteed by the United States of America, and will always be indirectly under the rule or supervision of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. Egypt was given some other minor satisfaction. For example, an agreement was reached about some sort of Israeli withdrawal from part of the Sinai Peninsula. The whole thing is a diabolical maneuver of American imperialism and its agents. It is, so to say, a temporary victory for American imperialism, because, as I said above, it has been decided that they will work toward the establishment of a so-called self-governing state on the west bank of the River Jordan and the Gaza Strip within 5 years. During this period, the so-called self-governing state will have some kind of independent police force of its own, but there will always be Israeli military and police forces there to protect the borders, as well as Jordanian forces. Thus, the Palestinians will have only nominal independence, and if a status quo such as that decided at Camp David is achieved, then a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel may be signed. The whole aim is that during this 5-year period, American imperialism will be left in relative peace to milk the Arab cow thoroughly so that the oil flows without hindrance into the American tankers and pipelines, while the United States of America conducts a campaign of intrigues in all the Arab states so that they accept the decisions of Camp David and arrive at a common conclusion about an alleged overall peace. However, the Palestinian people, quite rightly, accept no part of this deal between Sadat, Begin, and Jimmy Carter, because in fact they gain nothing. Their homeland is occupied, therefore, quite rightly, they will fight to the end for the liberation of the territories of their homeland and the establishment of a genuine government of the Palestinian people without interference and tutelage from their permanent enemies. December 1978. Imperialism and the Revolution. The fight against Israel, the most bloodthirsty tool of U.S. imperialism, which has become a great stumbling block to the advance of the Arab peoples, is a common problem for all these peoples. In practice, however, not all the Arab states are of one mind about the struggle they should wage jointly against Israel, and about the character the struggle against their common enemy should have. Frequently, some of them see the struggle from a narrow nationalist angle. We cannot agree with such a stand. We stick to our stand that Israel must withdraw to its own lair and renounce its chauvinist, provocative, offensive, and aggressive attitudes and actions against the Arab states. We demand that Israel give up the territories of the Arabs, that the Palestinians gain all their national rights. But we can never accept that the Israeli people should be wiped out. The efforts of the peoples of the Arab countries for complete liberation from the clutches of imperialism and social imperialism, for the strengthening of their freedom and sovereignty, are likewise the common problems of all these peoples. Our party has always energetically supported the just cause of the Arab peoples, without exception, and will continue to do so to the end. We support the struggle of the Palestinian people against Israel, which has long ago become a blind tool, a gendarme of U.S. imperialism. February 21, 1979. Developments in the Middle East are not favorable to imperialism. At present, Israel is in danger. Ayatollah Khomeini has declared openly that he will defend the Palestinians in their struggle against Israel. He has closed the Israeli embassy in Tehran and expelled the Israeli diplomats from Iran. The oil supplies which Israel received from the Shah of Iran have been cut off, and now it is obliged to get oil elsewhere. In these conditions, the United States of America is compelling Israel to reach agreement with Egypt. In other words, to accept the conditions Carter has laid down for such an agreement and to stop kicking against it. In view of this very dangerous situation in Iran, the Persian Gulf, and the whole Middle East, the United States of America has set the agents of the CIA in motion. They see that the Soviet threat could come from Iran or from Iraq, and could also come from Syria or from South Yemen, which can cross the Kali Desert and reach Oman, and join the Palestinians in Kuwait to stage a coup d'etat. If this were to happen, the United States of America would lose its whole strategic position and its economic power over the oil of the Middle East and Iran. March 31, 1979. An anti-Arab imperialist treaty. As is known, in recent days in Washington, in a big marquee specially set up by Carter in the White House front garden, before an audience of 1,000 or so people, apart from the public watching outside the garden fence, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel was signed, with Carter signing as witness, on a desk used traditionally by the Americans for the signing of various enslaving imperialist treaties. Hence, an imperialist treaty was signed following an aggressive imperialist war of plunder declared by Zionism, powerfully supported with arms and munitions and financed by American imperialism. The purpose which Israel had and achieved in this war of plunder was to liquidate the homeland of the Palestinians, to occupy Jerusalem, the west bank of the Jordan River, the Gaza Strip, and the whole of Sinai, and to be poised like a hawk, ready to strike at Lebanon and Egypt. Apart from this, the aggressive armies of Israel also occupied the Golan Heights, which belonged to Syria. This was the aim of the aggressive imperialist war against the Arab peoples of Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and, indirectly, all the other Arab peoples. Through this predatory war, Israel, powerfully supported by American imperialism, also had the aim of keeping the oil-rich region of the Middle East, that is, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates of the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, Iran, etc., under the influence of American imperialism and forming a strong military-economic barrier against some other Arab countries and their partners, the Western capitalist countries, which rely heavily on the oil of the Middle East. The Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians, allegedly in unity but in fact divided, tried to withstand this aggressive war on several occasions, but without success, because they were not seriously united in their struggle against this barbarous invasion. They were defeated in the time of Farouk, of Nasser, and now of Sadat, and also under the monarchy of Hussein. Meanwhile, cosmopolitan Lebanon, where large numbers of Palestinians have settled, especially in the south of that country and on the border with Israel, has continually been the prey of the latter, and remains in this situation, facing the barbarous attacks of the Israeli infantry, artillery, and air force. Lebanon has also been turned into a country of civil wars between Syrians, Christian Maronites, and Islamic sects. The United States of America is acting with great speed and exerting threatening pressure on Israel and its Prime Minister, Begin, to have him sign a peace treaty with Egypt, a treaty best described as worthless. Through the signing of this treaty, Egypt is placing itself in opposition to all the other Arab states. To save face, Sadat wanted the Palestinians to take part in this agreement, but they refused, or else to insert in the treaty some clause under which the Palestinians' future right to have their own homeland, of which Israel has robbed them, would allegedly be recognized. In reality, of course, he worked to find some formula under which this lawful and natural right of the Palestinian people would never be recognized. United with the Palestinians are the Syrians, first of all, because they are faced with an Israeli-Egyptian, quote, unity, which makes it more difficult for them to regain the Golan Heights. Hence, if they are going to try to take their Golan Heights, they will have to link themselves closely in a fighting unity with the other Arab countries which oppose this treaty. However, it is difficult for them to achieve such a fighting unity. Before the treaty was concluded, it was stated that a meeting of all countries which opposed the Israeli-Egyptian treaty would be held in Baghdad. In fact, the representatives of these countries gathered there, but soon dispersed because not all of them agreed to break off relations with Egypt, to boycott Egypt, and declare Sadat a traitor to the Arab cause, who was sold out to Israel and American imperialism. Of course, at this meeting, Syria and Iraq were probably closest to one another, and 3/4 in support of the most resolute, that is, the Palestinians. But Saudi Arabia and the Emirates of the Gulf were cool to the idea, while some others were mostly talk. Of these latter countries, Gaddafi's Libya has raised its voice a little louder and moved troops toward Egypt, simply as a show of force, of course, while Sadat, before returning to Egypt, gave the order for his troops to move to the west, because now their flank on the Suez Canal is free, so he's deploying the army on the border with Libya. April 3, 1979. The other Arab countries boycott Egypt. The official text of the resolution, which was approved by the Conference of the Council of the Arab League, the level of foreign ministers held in Baghdad, has been published. Superficially at least, this conference produced results against the Egyptian government. This resolution says that by signing the peace treaty with Israel, the government of the Arab Republic of Egypt has disregarded the resolutions of the Arab Summit Conference, especially the resolutions taken at the summit conferences at Rabat and Algiers, the resolutions of the 9th Arab Summit Conference, and that it has disregarded the appeal of the Arab kings and presidents not to sign any peace treaty with the Zionist enemy. According to this resolution, the participants in the Conference of Baghdad consider the signing of the peace treaty with Israel by Sadat's government as a betrayal. The resolution declares that with this act the Egyptian government deserted the Arab ranks and chose the policy of collaboration with the United States of America to take the same position as the enemy. The Sadat government is accused of abandoning the national duty to liberate the occupied Arab territories, especially Jerusalem, to regain the inalienable national rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to return to their homeland and the right to self-determination, to create an independent state of Palestine on their own national territory, of failing to safeguard Arab solidarity and unity, and defend the Arab cause, etc. This resolution contains many other decisions linked with concrete sanctions against Egypt. In other words, in Baghdad, the Arab countries took a decision by means of which they boycott the Arab Republic of Egypt, brand Sadat as a traitor, and reject the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, which was signed on March 26, 1979, jointly with Jimmy Carter at Camp David in the United States of America. Of course, this will have consequences in Egypt, but it seems to me that not all the Arab countries which met in Baghdad are fully determined in their stand against Egypt. On the surface, it seems as though the resolution was taken unanimously, but apart from Syria, which is interested because part of its territory is occupied by Israel, apart from the Palestinians, who are left without a homeland and whose cause went totally unheeded in the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, and Iraq, which stands behind Syria, that is, apart from those who are most interested in opposing Egypt, the other states, such as Saudi Arabia, do not take the same stand. These states are wavering. They will wobble as the situations and circumstances dictate in the direction of the American policy and will not completely break off their contacts with Egypt. For his part, King Hussein is opposed to the treaty, but is pro-American at the same time. He is opposed to breaking off contacts with Egypt because he is afraid lest one day the nearly 500,000 Palestinians who live in Jordan may topple him. Thus he poses as pro-Palestinian, but in reality is a lackey of the Americans and Saudi Arabia. This is the view we must take of Arab unity, which has not been achieved irrespective of the fact that the countries taking part in the Baghdad meeting emerged with a common conclusion. The United States of America will certainly work to keep them under its influence. Who knows whether eventually Syria, too, may become involved in long and difficult negotiations with Israel, and thus the question of the Golan Heights may be liquidated in one way or another. Hence, the losers in all this are the Palestinians, who are left without a homeland, and so the problems in the Middle East will go on forever unresolved, while the great powers operate according to their own interests. Only uprisings of the peoples can put an end to such a difficult and complicated situation in this zone, in which Soviet social imperialism, American imperialism, and the other capitalist states of the world have planted their feet. This is a sensitive zone of very great strategic importance, a zone of oil, a zone of inter-imperialist wars, of a war of plunder which only the peoples of this zone, and not the representatives of the forces which are in power in certain countries of this zone, are able to withstand. These forces combine or split according to the interests of the bourgeoisie which they represent and which dominates in those countries, and not according to the national interests of the peoples whom they rule. They link themselves with American imperialism or Soviet social imperialism according to the interests of the big oil bourgeoisie. May 26, 1979. Political panorama. With Egypt and its conflict with Israel, which implies the conflict of all the Arab peoples, including the Palestinian people, with the Israeli aggressors, we go on to the second key point of the present international situation. With the signing of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, a new situation was created. All the Arab countries opposed this treaty, publicly at least, because it is an unjust treaty and sacrifices the interests of the Palestinian people. In fact, contrary to the joint policy of the Arab countries, Egypt signed this treaty with Israel, which is an agency of the United States of America in the Middle East, got back only a part of the territories occupied by Israel, and completely forgot the Golan Heights and the Palestinians. This is why it is so, quote, sternly opposed by all the other Arab countries, and also by Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. In this allegedly Arab alliance, however, there is no complete unity of views and actions against Sadat for his betrayal of the common cause of the Palestinians and Syria. For example, although Saudi Arabia and the Emirates of the Persian Gulf take part in this grouping, which opposes the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, still they have one hand held out to it and the other to American imperialism because they are worried about their petrodollars. The Palestinian people are not laying down their arms either. Through their struggle, they are displaying their dauntless fighting spirit, but the great evil is that they have been left without a homeland and are fighting wherever they have the possibility to establish themselves. The present government of Egypt maintains a stand of stern opposition to the Palestinians, although it may be stern only in appearance, because it would not be surprising if al-Fatah were secretly working with Egypt to turn the Gaza Strip and the West Bank into a state with a certain autonomy for the Palestinians. This may appear a vague idea, but not without foundation. Meanwhile, the Palestinians in Lebanon are under the continual attacks of Israeli bomber aircraft in reply to any action they launch, actions which are expressions of their struggle for the liberation of their lost homeland. At present, all the countries which oppose Egypt are defending the Palestinian cause, but this defense is more substantial here, timid there, and elsewhere only in words. It is not surprising that the Palestinians settled in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, and especially in the Emirates of the Persian Gulf and Iran, serve as a means of pressure by these states against American imperialism, and at the same time also as an obstacle to the agreements which these states might make with the imperialist and social imperialist powers. Even the Palestinians are not linked in a strong unity. Their situation is a reflection of the many contradictions which weaken the Arab peoples and states themselves. There are many different factions in the ranks of the Palestinian fighters. Because of the vacillation of Arafat and al-Fatah, it is uncertain what policy they are pursuing, while Habash, who presents himself as very intransigent against Israel and is not in agreement with al-Fatah, might reach agreement with the social imperialist Soviet Union in order to achieve his aim. Thus, the Middle East is not and never will be tranquil, and irrespective of the fact that the positions of American imperialism have been somewhat strengthened with the signing of the Israeli-Egyptian Treaty, the policy of the United States of America is still in great difficulties in this major region, the so-called oil zone, the Arab zone. There will be no peace in this region because the contradictions among the American, British, French imperialists and between them and the Soviet imperialists, and the various ruling cliques which will take the side of one or the other imperialist state, as well as the contradictions of the peoples against the ruling classes, will increase continuously. Socialist Albania, although it is small, through political, economic, and cultural context, has become known and enjoys a very fine reputation among all the peoples of these countries. Indeed, even among many of their leaders that have contradictions with the superpowers and the developed capitalist states. So, in these countries there is admiration for Albania, for its principled policy, for its courage and valor, for its independence and sovereignty, which it keeps inviolate of foreign powers, as well as for its continuous support for their struggle against the Israeli aggressors, against American and Soviet imperialism, especially for the struggle of the Palestinian people for their national and social liberation. Our stand and policy make deep impressions on those peoples who aspire to genuine freedom and independence. They are impressed also by our socialist order, which they dream about but which they still do not see clearly and do not realize how it can be achieved and how a new society can be built as in our country. We are convinced that the new society will be built there too. June 26, 1979. The superpowers sabotaged the true unity of the Arab peoples. Syria is relying on the Soviets. They are supplying it with arms and credits. The aid of the Soviet Union is not sincere. In reality, it is not defended and is not defending Syria from the Israelis. On the contrary, the Soviets are providing Syria with outdated weapons, while they are supplying Israel with cannon fodder. All the Jews of the Soviet Union, tens of thousands a year, are being sent to Israel. This kind of emigration augments and strengthens the army of Dayan and Begin. With these people, Israeli Zionist colonies are founded on the occupied territories of the heroic Palestinian people. The universal example of the heroic struggle of the Palestinian people is what ought to create that sense of unity for the elimination of the heavy burden of intrigues and oppression imposed by the imperialists and local capitalists. The Palestinians, a people without a homeland, are showing the world that the fight for freedom, for land, for bread, for democracy, the revolutionary armed struggle, is the only way to salvation. Justice, the basis of unity, lies in the struggle. Regrettably, the Palestinians too are divided among themselves, and their division is inspired by their Arab brothers. There are Palestinians who are incited by the Syrians, others who are influenced by the Emirates of the Gulf, others by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so on. The Soviets pretend that they are assisting Arafat, who travels back and forth to Moscow, and from one capital city to another. But he too is in opposition to various Palestinian currents which are fighting against Israel, the United States of America, and Egypt, which joined up with Israel and left the Palestinians in the lurch. January 10, 1981. Kissinger in the Middle East again. For some days, one of the most ferocious enemies of the Palestinian people, and the other Arab peoples, the notorious Henry Kissinger, a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of Zionism, has been prowling around the Middle East. This time, he has gone there not as a state functionary, but as the special envoy of President Reagan, to poke and probe and plot against the Arab peoples, and above all, to look after the interests of the American oil and arms monopolies. Wherever he has gone, to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Oman, or elsewhere, not without purpose he has boosted Camp David and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, about which he boasts that he has, quote, contributed his efforts to bring it about. Everywhere he has appealed for, quote, regional understanding. In other words, for ending the fight against the Israeli aggressors, for accepting the Israeli occupation of Arab territories on the west bank of the Jordan, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and parts of Sinai, what is called the State of Israel with secure borders, as an accomplished fact. More than once he has made open and arrogant threats about the, quote, determination of the American government for a greater military involvement in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. This is Henry Kissinger, the strategist who formulated the anti-Arab policy of Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, and now Reagan. April 11, 1981. The Palestinians oppose the Israeli terror. For some days we have been reading many reports about demonstrations of the Palestinian people against the violence and terror which the Israelis employ against them in the occupied Arab territories as well as in the Palestinian camps in southern Lebanon. The resistance of the Palestinian forces is great everywhere, and especially on the West Bank. Meanwhile, there is talk about a landing on a mass scale of Israeli special units supported by a heavy artillery barrage at a number of points in the region northwest of Beirut, at Nabatea, Tyre, and elsewhere. Fighting is taking place. There are dead and wounded. The Israelis have suffered heavy losses. Besides their military activities, the Israelis are also continuing their expropriation of the land and property of Palestinian families in order to set up new Jewish settlements on them. These inhuman actions, the savage terror against the Palestinians, increases the grief which I have been feeling these days for our brothers of Kosovo, who have been subjected to savage terror by the great Serb Titoites. Just like the racist Zionists of Tel Aviv, the great Serb Titoites, too, are employing illegal means and inhuman violence and terror against the Albanians of Kosovo simply because they are demanding their political and economic rights on the basis of and within the constitution of Yugoslavia itself. With these actions, however, both the Israelis and the great Serbs are only harming themselves. May 27, 1981. The Palestinians' murderer in Moscow. King Hussein of Jordan is on an official visit to Moscow, where he has been welcomed with all the honors befitting him as a monarch and an old friend of the Soviet social imperialists, and also as a buyer of their weapons. Hussein has met Brezhnev to exchange ideas about a, quote, international conference which will settle the problem of the Middle East. Hussein, the murderer of Palestinians, is received by Brezhnev, a, quote, friend of the Palestinians, in order to settle the problem of the Middle East, in the center of which is the Palestinian people. That is how far the, quote, friendship of the Soviet social imperialists goes for the Palestinian people and the other Arab peoples. For the Soviet social imperialists, the problem is the arms traffic and not genuine friendship with the peoples. The Arab peoples, and especially the long-suffering and heroic Palestinian people, must never forget this for one moment. August 10, 1981. On the Middle East, on the struggle of the Arab peoples. Notes. In the chapter on the international situation in the report to the Eighth Party Congress, we must certainly devote as much space as the conditions allow to events which are connected with the Middle East. Among other things, we must point out 1. The struggle of the Arab peoples against the Israeli occupiers and their American patrons has assumed greater dimensions and intensity. In the center of this struggle stand the heroic Palestinian people, who, for decades on end, and in extremely difficult conditions, have been waging a titanic battle to return to their homeland captured by the Israelis, and to ensure their right to live free and independent on their mother soil. September 7, 1981. Note. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, arrived in Washington for talks with the American President, Reagan. As on every other occasion, this visit too is linked with the demand of the Israeli government for political and military support from American imperialism on the eve of its new anti-Arab adventures. In fact, during the whole of the recent period, the Israeli army has continued to bombard Palestinian camps in Lebanon, has continued its campaign of terror against the Palestinians, and the implanting of Jews on the territories of the Palestinians. Israeli military provocations against Lebanon and the other Arab countries have been stepped up. As the signs show, Israel is preparing for new military attacks, not simply raids against the Palestinians, but a large-scale military intervention in Lebanon, and even for provocations against the Syrian military forces stationed in that country. November 1, 1981. Report to the 8th Congress of the Party of Labor of Albania. Besides the upsurge and extension of the struggle of the working class, a general awakening of the oppressed peoples, a strengthening of national feelings, and a greater desire to be free, independent, and sovereign can be seen today. The people's liberation movements have grown in extent and enhanced their quality. Their anti-imperialist, anti-social imperialist, and anti-neo-colonialist character has been strengthened. The struggle of the Iranian people, who rose in revolution and swept away the Shah and his medieval regime and threw out his American patrons, was a heavy blow to imperialism. In Iran, the United States of America suffered a major political defeat, which it is unable to reverse through diplomatic methods and economic blackmail, or even through military intervention, as it attempted and failed to do at Tabaz. In Iran, American imperialism lost one of its most important sources of oil, lost colossal profits, and lost its credibility as an invincible protector of its Arab, quote, allies of the Persian Gulf. The Egyptian-Israeli compromise at Camp David was shaken, and open and surreptitious disagreements with its NATO partners emerged. The struggle of the Arab peoples against the Israeli occupiers and their American patrons has assumed greater proportions and intensity. In the center of this struggle stand the heroic Palestinian people, who, in extraordinarily difficult conditions, have been waging a titanic battle for tens of years to regain the homeland denied them, to secure their rights and live free and independent on their mother soil. A sincere and ancient friendship links the Albanian people with the fraternal Arab peoples. We have supported and will continue to support to the end, and energetically, the just struggle of the Arab peoples for the liberation of the Arab territories occupied by the Israeli Zionist aggressors, and the re-establishment of all the legitimate rights of the martyred Palestinian people. In the People's Socialist Republic of Albania, and in the Albanian people, the heroic Palestinian people and their lawful representative, the Palestine Liberation Organization, have had and will always have sincere friends and resolute defenders of their just national cause. January 13, 1982. New plots against the Palestinian people. The great imperialist Zionist plot against the Arab peoples and, first of all, the martyred Palestinian people is becoming more and more concrete. I read in news agency reports that the American president, Reagan, has sent a new message to the Israeli Prime Minister, Begin, to assure him publicly that the United States of America is determined to guarantee the, quote, security of Israel at all times. This message, along with the large amounts of financial and military aid for the Begin government, which the American imperialists have recently been increasing day by day, speaks of a new premeditated step on their part, which will be a further encouragement to the Israelis' aggressive and adventurous anti-Arab policy to legalize what are called the, quote, secure borders of Israel. Through this policy of secure borders, Israel intends to keep the main parts of the occupied Arab territory, especially the West Bank of the Jordan River, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, under permanent occupation. There will be fresh developments in the Middle East, especially in the anti-Palestinian policies of imperialism, Zionism, and reaction. February 8, 1982. Note: recently, top-ranking American politicians and military men have been making pilgrimages to the Middle East. Through these visits, American imperialism is, of course, trying to consolidate the positions and privileges which it has won in this region of the world, especially in the context of economic and military strategy. This time, the Secretary of Defense, Weinberger, has set out on a new tour of the Middle East. Apart from the aims of tightening the screws on the vassals of the United States and concretizing its anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian plots, he is going there as the intermediary of the American monopolies and armaments industry to sell modern armaments to the lackey allies of the United States of America. Weinberger commenced his present tour in Saudi Arabia, to which, according to news agencies, the United States is going to sell the most modern armaments, including F-15 supersonic aircraft and AWACS radar aircraft, after first receiving assurances from the ruling monarchy of that country that these armaments will not be used against Israel. Then against whom will these modern armaments be used? Obviously, they will be used to suppress the national liberation movements of neighboring Arab peoples, and, as some say, they might also be used against Iran. April 26, 1982. Israel's grave threats. In recent days, events in Lebanon are assuming a more acute and savage character. Fratricidal war is going on in Beirut amongst various factions of the Lebanese people, with special emphasis on armed provocations against the Palestinian forces in the southern regions of the city. Directly involved in all these events are the American imperialists, and especially the Israelis, who are trying to liquidate the organized Palestinian forces in Lebanon. As Western news agencies report, Prime Minister Begin has made an arrogant declaration threatening the sovereignty of Lebanon. Speaking about recent events in that country and about the situation in Beirut in particular, he said, amongst other things, quote, "We shall consider the possibility of the occupation of Lebanon," unquote. This declaration has made an impression on world opinion, because it is an escalation of the already tense situation, constitutes a forewarning of imminent dangers, and shows that the Israeli aggressors are preparing new plans for war against the Arab peoples, first of all, against the Palestinian people. In this arrogant stand, disdainful of world opinion, Israel has the open support of American imperialism and the secret support of Soviet social imperialism, both of them interested in increasing the tension in this region of the world and liquidating the resistance of the Palestinian people. The imperialist and social imperialist wolves and their jackals want to fish in troubled waters because this makes it easier for them to hatch up plots and plunder the wealth of the peoples of the Middle East. It is essential that the Arab peoples, and first of all the Palestinian people, increase their vigilance and combine in a genuine unity to cope with the danger which is threatening them. Only through uncompromising struggle can the Israeli aggressors and their imperialist and social imperialist patrons be dealt with. July 8, 1982. The Israelis occupy Beirut de facto. I am carefully following developments in Lebanon, where, as I have written previously, there is a very grave and dangerous situation. For several days, the Israeli Air Force and naval and land artillery have been severely bombing the capital of that country, Beirut, especially the outlying suburbs, where the Palestinian population and their organized forces are concentrated. News agencies are talking about an advance of tens of thousands of troops of the Israeli army, heavily armed and with modern mechanized means, toward Beirut. From what we read in news agency reports and see on TV, we are faced with the de facto occupation of Beirut by the Israeli army and the implementation of long-standing plans for driving the Palestinians out of Beirut and the whole of Lebanon. Where did the Israeli aggressors find the boldness to challenge the sovereignty of an independent state like Lebanon and attack the freedom of its people? American imperialism is defending them. Today, I read a report which said that Yitzhak Shamir, the foreign minister of Israel, has declared, quote, "The United States of America has worked out plans to use its land and naval forces to settle the Lebanese crisis," unquote. And Shamir does not make these statements, so compromising to the Americans, for nothing. On the contrary, he is sure of such a support because he himself was recently in Washington and received all-around assurances from the American government. In fact, the American Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, with several hundred aircraft and about 8,000 American Marines specialized in urban warfare, is being reinforced and directed toward the shores of Lebanon. We shall see how events develop. Will the Lebanese tolerate the occupation of their country by the Israelis? Will the Palestinians yield to the brutality of the Israelis? Will the other Arab countries reconcile themselves to the occupation of Lebanon? The coming days will give us the answers to these questions. I think that the Israelis will make every effort to implement their plans of conquest, but will encounter stern resistance in Lebanon, especially from the Palestinian fighters. One thing attracts attention. While Israel is operating openly and has the open support of the United States of America, the Soviet Union is merely making threatening statements in the press about the possible consequences of the deterioration of the situation, setting its Mediterranean naval fleet in motion, and nothing more. August 22, 1982. A heavy blow to the Palestinians. What I had foreseen about the real aims of the Israeli military aggression against Lebanon, that is, the destruction of the organized forces of the Palestine Liberation Movement, is coming to pass. Yesterday, news agencies began to say that after fierce fighting between the Israeli military forces and Palestinian forces in Beirut, the Palestinians were withdrawing from Beirut to the regions north of that city, under the pressure of the Israeli army. Besides this, another very cunning maneuver is being carried out. Under the pretext that the withdrawal from Beirut of Palestinian forces, unharmed by the Israelis, must be, quote, ensured and guaranteed, an agreement has been sought and apparently achieved that a large number of troops of the United States of America, France, and Italy should be sent to Lebanon. These units, which will be called the Multinational Force, are supposed to supervise the withdrawal of the Palestinians. Each of these units will be under independent command and will be armed with all fighting means. I am following the events in Lebanon with special attention because they could have consequences for the whole of the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and Central Europe. That is, they could affect our country too. I have talked with the comrades and given instructions that we should continue through the press to expose the aggressive aims of Israel and the plots of American imperialism. We must continue to support the just struggle of the Palestinian people for their rights. August 25, 1982. The Americans land in Lebanon. News agencies report that 800 American Marines landed from the ships of the Sixth Fleet in Beirut today to, quote, restore order and to maintain, quote, peace between the warring factions. In reality, we have to do with an American military occupation of Lebanon in implementation of the strategic agreement recently reached between Reagan and Begin. On the basis of this agreement, the American government has pledged to use every means to defend the Israeli aggressors in their war against the Arabs and the Palestinians. It is said that besides the American troops, special detachments of the Italian army have arrived too, while the French detachments arrived some days ago. These troops, called the Multinational Force, are charged with the mission of, quote, calming the situation in Beirut, and, quote, supervising the withdrawal of the Palestinians from the Lebanese capital. September 21st, 1982. A grave crime against the Palestinians in Beirut. A very grave crime has been perpetrated these days in two Palestinian camps, Sabra and Shatila, on the western outskirts of Beirut. From dawn September 17 to September 18, armed units, said to be of the Lebanese Phalangist militia, and a dissident unit commanded by a certain Major Haddad, which is equipped, trained, and financed by the Israeli government, entered these two camps, which were surrounded by detachments of the Israeli army. They opened fire in the most barbarous way, massacring about 1,500 innocent, defenseless Palestinians, women, children, elderly men, boys and girls, sick people, and so on, without discrimination. In some cases, they wiped out whole families in the shelters where they had taken refuge. This crime was carried out in the darkness of the night, and a complete news blackout was maintained about it for more than 24 hours. Meanwhile, the aggressors have departed and have been able to cover their tracks. As news agencies report, journalists learned about this hideous crime after some delay, and mainly from the efforts of Palestinians still alive, but too terrified to leave the site of the crime. This event has caused profound indignation everywhere. Protests have begun, and demands are being made that the perpetrators of this inhuman crime must be brought to book. Israeli political and military circles are trying to exonerate themselves by saying that they know nothing about it, do not know who the murderers are, and so on. However, a number of contradictory statements, as well as the fact that these two camps were in the region which the detachments of the Israeli army control, speak of the opposite. Not only the high command of the Israeli army of occupation in Beirut, but also the War Ministry, and Prime Minister Begin personally knew of this crime and had a hand in it. It is said that the Minister of Defense, Sharon, who heads the Israeli military units in Lebanon, and the Chief of the General Staff, Atan, authorized the perpetration of this crime under the silent protection of Israeli units, and subsequently imposed the news blackout. The crime committed at Sabra and Shatila is so grave that even in Tel Aviv itself, a commotion has begun demanding, quote, the revelation of the truth, and, quote, the punishment of those responsible, in order to save the, quote, honor of the Israeli people. On television these days, I've seen horrible scenes of the massacres which have been committed in these two Palestinian camps. Piles of corpses, children crying for their parents, grief-stricken women searching amongst the victims for members of their families, and so on. These are painful scenes which arouse indignation and hatred for these new barbarians. Only the German Nazis have perpetrated such monstrosities. All progressive mankind must sternly denounce the authors of this crime. How sorry I feel for the Palestinian people, expelled from their homeland and persecuted in the cruelest ways by the Israeli aggressors and other reactionary forces. And why? Because they are fighting for their rights, to return to their homeland, because they demand justice from those who do not want to know what justice is, but simply trample the rights of other peoples underfoot, as the Israelis and their patrons, the American imperialists, do. Through the press, we shall indignantly denounce this barbarous crime against the Palestinian population and expose its direct authors and their savage supporters as war criminals. September 21st, 1982. The, quote, condolences of the Soviet social imperialists. Today I read a report of the Palestinian news agency Wafa, according to which the ambassador of the Soviet Union to Syria has received the chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and handed him a message from Brezhnev in which the massacres of recent days in the Sabra and Shatila camps are, quote, condemned. The whole content of the message is not disclosed, but the very fact that it was handed to Arafat by the Soviet ambassador in the offices of the Soviet embassy in Damascus shows that it is of no greater value than any other message of condolences. Hence, with this message, Brezhnev tells Arafat, accept my condolences over the deaths at Sabra and Shatila. The stand which the Soviet Union is taking about recent developments in the Middle East, and in particular toward the great plot for the destruction of the Palestinian movement and the physical liquidation of the Palestinian people, is a very clear indication of the treacherous anti-Arab policy of the Soviet social imperialists. Their friendship and military aid are false and ineffectual. It is known that the Soviet Union sells Syria armaments, including supersonic aircraft and missiles of the latest types. However, they were not used to counter the attacks by the Israelis with modern American weapons. Why? Because their firing mechanism remains in the hands of Soviet military experts. The same thing occurred with Egypt too, and the consequences are known. The modern weapons which the Soviet Union supplies to Syria under the label of sincere friendship are not to defend Syria and the Palestinians, but to say to the Americans and Israel, I am here too. Hence, the Soviet Union does this for its own interests as a superpower. Whenever Israel has launched heavy military attacks on the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat and other Palestinian leaders have been invited urgently to Moscow, and each time stern communiques have been issued saying that the struggle of the Palestinian people will be supported with every means. However, the means have always been messages of condolences. Israel is well aware of this. Concretely, in the last 2 months, the world has seen a number of serious military attacks made by Israel and the United States of America against the Palestinian and Lebanese peoples. For instance, the occupation of Lebanon, the forced expulsion of the Palestinian fighters from Beirut, etc. Progressive mankind also saw a grave and inhuman event, the massacre of the innocent, defenseless Palestinian population in Sabra and Shatila. Notwithstanding this tragedy, Brezhnev is trying to get out of his official pledges toward the Arab peoples and countries with no more than a message of denunciation over the massacres of Sabra and Shatila addressed to Arafat. This sort of stand simply encourages the unrestrained arrogance of Israel and the United States of America against the Arabs and the Palestinians. November 10, 1982. Work and vigilance to make the people's state power ever stronger. An address to the electors. The present situation in the Middle East has become very disturbing. The new Israeli aggression against Lebanon, organized, financed, and incited by the American imperialists, has created direct threats and dangers, not only for the peoples of the surrounding zone, but also for those of a much wider area. Taking advantage of the great American aid and the divisions amongst the Arab peoples, Israel has extended its range of provocations and wants to destroy, one after the other, all the countries which do not accept the grabbing of Arab territories and genocide imposed on the long-suffering Palestinian people. The expansionist policy and activity of Israel at the expense of the Arabs is also incited and favored by the policy of the Soviet Union, its behind-the-scenes deals and plots to the detriment of the Arab peoples. After Camp David, Israel attacked Lebanon. Now it is demanding the submission of Jordan and is threatening Syria with war. Whose turn will it be tomorrow? Iraq's, Saudi Arabia's, or Iran's? The American and Israeli staffs are still thinking about and working for this. But will the brave Arab peoples allow Israel and its American bosses to do whatever they please to their detriment? Will they remain divided as they are, so that Israel and American imperialism defeat and crush them one by one, as they're doing? We believe that this will not happen. The Arab peoples are freedom-loving peoples with very ancient fighting traditions, peoples that have given mankind a whole civilization. They will certainly find the strength to unite and stop the Zionist aggressors from grabbing the Arab lands and exterminating the people who inhabit them. However protracted the struggle, however great the difficulties, and however many the sacrifices required of them, victory will be theirs. Right is on their side, the whole of progressive mankind is with them. Our people have always stood beside the fraternal Arab peoples, the heroic Palestinian people, and supported their just cause. In the future, too, the just struggle of the Arabs and Palestinians will have the full and unreserved support of the Albanian people. January 6, 1983. The anti-Arab actions of Israel are approved in Washington. The United States of America is the main supporter of all the anti-Arab political and military actions of the State of Israel. If the anti-Arab plans are carried out by Tel Aviv, they are prepared and put on paper in Washington. This is a truth which the events and life have proved. On January 4, Yitzhak Navan, the head of state of Israel, arrived in Washington for a, quote, official visit and consultations, unquote, with the leading circles of the United States of America. As news agencies report, on this occasion he made a statement which has a well-defined aim and meaning. Among other things, he said, quote, the pre-war borders of 1967 do not guarantee the security of Israel, unquote, while the city of Jerusalem will remain a, quote, undivided city, and indeed, quote, the capital of Israel. After this he added, quote, Israel will never accept the creation of an independent Palestinian state, unquote. The aggressive and arrogant character of these declarations, which constitute the essence of the anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian policy of Israel, requires no comment. These statements are made only with the approval of the patron, American imperialism, and are not pressure exerted by the government of Tel Aviv on the American government for further aid. February 25, 1983. Reagan threatens the Palestinians. At the beginning of the year, a statement made in Washington by Yitzhak Navon, head of state of Israel, about the anti-Arab pretensions of his country, made an impression on me. On that occasion, I noted that such an anti-Arab declaration, especially when made on American soil, could not be made by Navon or any other Israeli state leader without the knowledge and approval of the American government. Today I read in the news agency reports about a press conference of President Reagan in which he touches on the Palestinian people and their just struggle. What does Reagan say? The, quote, package peace plan for the Middle East, which the Americans have drafted, must include, quote, something in the nature of a homeland for the Palestinians. Quote, no one, he says, quote, has expressed himself in favor of a Palestinian state, unquote. Hence, for the head of American imperialism, the Palestinians are and remain a refugee people without a homeland, and moreover, have no right to exercise their sovereignty. Immediately after these anti-Palestinian statements, Reagan adds that, quote, if need be, the American detachments, which are part of the multinational force deployed in Beirut, quote, will patrol southern Lebanon, i.e. near the borders of Israel, quote, in order to defend it. Is this not complete and open support for the anti-Arab declarations that Navon made and which had to do with guaranteeing the borders of Israel in the occupied Arab territories, and refusal to recognize an independent Palestinian state? Comment, I haven't commented a lot during this reading, but that one reminds me, I think it was during the U.S. invasion of Panama, which was sold to the public as, standing up for the rights of a small country. One of the leaders of one of the American Indian tribes wrote a letter to then-President George Bush Sr. as a kind of parody saying, help, Mr. President, my people are being oppressed by a much larger country. Please come help us. Obviously, this was a joke because he's talking about the United States. Continuing. August 17, 1983. Ceausescu, the Arabs and Israel. The role of intermediary which Ceausescu plays, not only between China and the United States of America, but also between other countries, has long been known. He has been no less involved in mediation at very difficult moments between Israel and a number of Arab governments. Now that a real situation of occupation has been created in Lebanon by the Israeli army and the multinational force of the United States, France, Italy, and Britain, when the anger and indignation amongst progressive mankind over the grave and inhuman crimes which the Israelis organized last year against the Palestinian civilian inhabitants of Sabra and Shatila have still not died down, Ceausescu is welcoming and holding cordial talks with Shamir, the foreign minister of Israel. What are they talking about? As the news agencies say, they're discussing mediation to re-establish diplomatic relations between Israel and the Soviet Union and other countries of Eastern Europe. Undoubtedly, Ceausescu has undertaken this role and will try to carry it out because, like all his other attempts at mediation, it might bring him some economic advantage. However, I think that the greatest aid which he's trying to give Israel at these moments and in this situation is to somewhat reduce the indignation of international public opinion toward the criminal anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian policy of Tel Aviv. This is not the first time that Ceausescu has come out on the side of Israel, and he frequently has cordial meetings and talks with the heads of Tel Aviv. Next to Washington, the capital city to which the heads of the Israeli government go most frequently is Bucharest. The heads of a number of Arab countries go there too. It is regrettable, however, that Arafat and some others in the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization have illusions about these meetings. December 10, 1983. A serious and harmful situation within the ranks of the Palestinian movement. One of the main aims of American imperialism, Soviet social imperialism, Zionism, and Arab reaction has always been to sabotage any movement for national and social liberation in the Middle East, which is one of the regions of the world richest in oil. In this context, their immediate objective is to destroy the liberation movement of the Palestinian people by inciting feuds and fratricide amongst Palestinians. While there have been, and still are, contradictions between them over the question of oil, of spheres of influence, or the possession of strategic regions, over the liquidation of the Palestinian people, they have no contradictions, but on the contrary, have a tacit, all-around agreement. Through their intrigues, through the activity of their secret agencies, through compromising individuals with money and blandishments, the enemies of the Palestinian people have managed to achieve some results. That there have been opposing tendencies, groups with differing programs and aims within the Palestine Liberation Organization, is a truth which cannot be covered up. Likewise, the other fact cannot be denied, namely that between these opposing currents and groups there have been some political squabbles, sometimes very grave ones, which have had a negative influence on the struggle of the Palestinian people to return to their homeland, to their own national territories. Now, however, it seems to me that matters have gone much further, and the quarrels have become much more profound, so that they are endangering the movement itself and the continuation of the struggle of the Palestinian people in general. For some days, the news agencies have been speaking about a serious split in the ranks of the leadership of the PLO between Arafat and one of his military aides, Abu Musa. These quarrels have reached the point of bitter armed clashes with serious consequences for both sides. Abu Musa, supported by the Syrian military units deployed in the Bekaa Valley, has risen in revolt and is fighting against Arafat and his supporters, compelling them to withdraw into the besieged Lebanese city of Tripoli. What is Abu Musa demanding? Under the accusation that Arafat has betrayed the revolution and usurped the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Abu Musa is demanding his resignation from the leadership of that organization and his final withdrawal with all his supporters, about 4,000 men, from Lebanese soil. For his part, Arafat is accusing Syria and Libya, with which he has disagreements, of being the main inciters of Abu Musa and trying through him to take control of the whole leadership, the PLO, and hinder the Palestinian liberation struggle. Meanwhile, the fratricidal fighting continues with the greatest severity, a thing which is truly regrettable because it serves only to sabotage the struggle and the revolution of the Palestinian people and helps to destroy their unity. The Israelis and all the enemies of Palestine and the Palestinian people are fanning up and pouring benzene on the flames of these fratricidal clashes, warming their blood-stained hands and gloating over the Palestinian blood which is being shed every day. Without doubt, the Palestinian people and the genuine Palestinian fighters are opposed to this split in this fratricidal fight, and I would like to hope that reason will triumph over the hatred implanted by others, over the individual jealousy and non-national interests. The Palestinian people and their valiant fighters need unity amongst themselves in order to triumph over their savage and merciless enemies, the Israelis and their patrons, the American imperialists, the Soviet social imperialists, and the Arab reactionary feudal bourgeois forces. The split is in favor of these enemies and their anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab plans and plots. December 19, 1983, the end of a very harmful fratricidal war. After a great deal of fighting and all-around pressure, and faced with the danger of even greater damage to the organized Palestinian forces and the major damage which could be inflicted on the local inhabitants, Arafat agreed to withdraw, together with his supporters, from the Lebanese city of Tripoli, where he has been besieged for some days. In the news agency reports, we see repeated facts which show that this business has been decided, and the question being discussed now is how and with what means about 4,000 Palestinian fighters, together with their armaments and families, will be evacuated. Profiting from the new situation which has been created, the Israelis have imposed very onerous conditions. The Palestinians are to leave, but first they must surrender their heavy weapons. Second, Arafat must be handed over to be, quote, tried and, quote, executed for, quote, the crimes he has committed against the Israelis. Otherwise, say the rulers of Israel, their warships will attack and sink any ships which transport the Palestinians. This is how far their unrestrained arrogance and savage hate for the Palestinian people have gone. Meanwhile, those who hatched up this fratricidal war amongst the Palestinian fighters, including the American imperialists and the Soviet social imperialists, are, quote, holding out the hand, offering their aid, and showing them the ways how to withdraw from Lebanon, etc. For example, it has been suggested that Arafat and the Palestinian fighters should leave on ships of a country neutral in this conflict, that they should board the ships under the protection of the multinational force stationed in Beirut, that the transport ships should be protected on the high sea by French and Italian warships, etc. Meanwhile, the Israeli government is putting its threats into practice, has stationed its warships close to the port of Tripoli, and from time to time makes artillery attacks on the places where the Palestinian fighters have begun to assemble. We shall see how this business proceeds. In any case, the Palestinian fighters have received another heavy blow, which will undoubtedly have consequences on the further development of their just struggle to return to their homeland. December 21, 1983. The Palestinians have left Tripoli. News agencies report that the departure of the Palestinian fighters from the Lebanese port of Tripoli on Greek transport ships, escorted by Italian and French warships and under the close observation of Israeli warships, began at last yesterday. Arafat is on one of the Greek ships. The ships will call at a port of Cyprus. From there, the Palestinians will go in various directions, for example to Tunisia, South Yemen, and by air to Iraq. Last evening, I saw on TV some scenes of the forced departure of the Palestinian fighters. Amongst them, I saw men who held a rifle high with one hand and a small son or daughter with the other. Where are these now homeless people going to go? What awaits them where they go? What does the future hold for them, their families, and their children? What a bitter fate the long-suffering Palestinian people have had. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that irrespective of these heavy blows, irrespective of the struggle waged against them from all sides, they will triumph. The peoples cannot be conquered. The Palestinian people cannot be conquered. We have always been on the side of the Palestinian people, and always will be. December 23, 1983. Arafat meets Mubarak. I am following the odyssey of the Palestinian fighters who have left Lebanon for still unknown destinations. I read a news agency report that one of the ships which is transporting the Palestinian fighters had entered the Suez Canal. Yesterday, Arafat, who was on board it, landed at the port of Ismailia and went to Cairo where he met the Egyptian President Mubarak. This meeting is causing a great sensation. Why? Because it is a completely unforeseen, unexpected meeting. As everyone knows, Egypt has accepted the Camp David Accords and has signed the peace agreement with Israel. It has established diplomatic relations with Israel. Hitherto, the Palestine Liberation Organization and Arafat personally have been opposed to these actions of Egypt, and indeed, they left Cairo for this reason. We shall soon learn what is really hidden behind this change and this unexpected meeting of Arafat and Mubarak, and what its consequences will be for the struggle of the Palestinian people. December 1983. The Middle East in the year 1983. Notes. Special envoys of the presidents and governments of the two superpowers undertook frequent journeys with top-secret special missions to Tel Aviv, Riyadh, Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and many other capital cities of the countries of the Arab world to offer the, quote, aid and mediation of their countries, but in reality to exert pressure and organize further plots against the Arab peoples, and, first of all, against the Palestinian people. During the year, I've recorded in my diary some of the moments and events which have impressed me most from the illegal and inhuman activity of the imperialist superpowers in Israel, as well as moments from the heroic struggle of the Palestinian, Arab, Afghan, and Iranian peoples against the plots of the two superpowers. I have also recorded some of my thoughts and feelings, the grief which I feel over the misfortunes which have descended upon these peoples, and the injustices perpetrated against them, as well as the great joy which I feel over their exemplary struggle for their freedom and national independence against the savage Israeli, imperialist, and social imperialist occupiers and enemies. Here, I'm making a summary of these general events. The Arab-Israeli conflict and its complications. The year 1983 can be considered the year of the consolidation of the de facto occupation of Lebanon by the Israeli armies, and the multinational force, which is made up of special detachments of the American, Italian, French, and British armies. This occupation was carried out, first of all, to strike a new blow against and to destroy the organized Palestinian forces centered in Lebanon. This means the practical application of the second part of the package plan of Israeli, imperialist, and Arab reaction to sabotage and completely paralyze the just struggle of the Palestinian people to return to their own homeland. After fierce fighting, the Israeli army, armed to the teeth with the most modern weapons and comprised of about 100,000 men, occupied Beirut and the main part of the southern zone of Lebanon. The Palestinian fighters resisted heroically, but, abandoned by their false friends, in the end were obliged to withdraw from Beirut to the zones north of the city and in the direction of the Bekaa Valley under the, quote, surveillance of the multinational force. Nevertheless, the occupation of Lebanon and the implementation of the plan for the destruction of the organized Palestinian forces could not be fully achieved without breaking up and damaging the unity of the Lebanese and Palestinian peoples. Thus, in 1983, the world was faced with two fratricidal wars incited by Israel, the United States, and certain reactionary circles of the Arab world. Fratricidal war was incited between various factions of the Lebanese people, between Christians and Muslims, and even between various Christian and Muslim sects, as between the Druze, the Shia, the Sunni Muslims, the Maronite Christians, and others. This war had very grave political and economic consequences for Lebanon, and, amongst other things, led to the destruction of the cosmopolitan and formerly wealthy city of Beirut. The other fratricidal war was that which was incited within the Palestinian Liberation Organization, between Palestinian fighters, between Arafat and his supporters on the one hand, and Abu Musa, at one time Arafat's right-hand man, on the other hand. This war ended with the complete withdrawal from Lebanon of Arafat, and about 4,000 partly disarmed Palestinian fighters. From all this fratricidal fighting, it was Israel that benefited, and the Palestinian people and their liberation movement that lost. During this year, in the context of the campaign of terror against the defenseless Palestinian population, and the attempts to drive from Lebanon about 300,000 to 400,000 Palestinians who had settled there since Israel drove them from their homeland, the agents of Israel in Lebanon organized and carried out in cold blood a massacre unprecedented for its ferocity in Sabra and Shatila, two undefended Palestinian camps on the periphery of Beirut. In the darkness of the night and under the supervision of the Israeli Regular Army, which allegedly had the duty to protect these camps from surprise attacks, some Lebanese fascist gangs in the service of Israel slaughtered more than 1,500 people, men, women, old folk and children, entire families without discrimination, in the most barbarous way. Those who perpetrated this inhuman crime, as well as their inciters and supporters, covered their tracks, were taken under protection, and remained unpunished. Nevertheless, the whole of progressive opinion throughout the world condemned them and branded them war criminals. During this year, a very grave situation was created also in the internal political affairs of Lebanon. The country remained almost continuously without a government and administration capable of running affairs, caring for the people, and opposing the actions of the Israeli occupiers. The reactionary Lebanese circles took advantage of the situation, organized and armed themselves, and carried out military actions against progressive Lebanese forces, especially against the Palestinians, contrary to the national interests of Lebanon. Nevertheless, the Lebanese people were not defeated. They took up arms and forcibly resisted the Israeli army of occupation and the other occupiers, especially the American and the French. Israeli, American, and French military targets were attacked, and serious damage was inflicted on them. Hence, the situation became no more peaceful, even though the Israeli army occupied Beirut, and the inspirers and supporters of Israel dispatched thousands of, quote, peacekeeping specialists, the multinational force, to Beirut. Therefore, the Israeli Air Force and Navy, and the Air Force and Naval Fleet of the United States of America, which included the aircraft carriers Nimitz, Eisenhower, and Independence, and tens of heavy cruisers, continued to bombard and strike the positions of the Palestinian and Lebanese fighters in the mountains around Beirut, and especially in the Bekaa Valley, with all their firepower. The American Air Force and naval artillery have also bombarded the joint Arab-Syrian forces which have been deployed in the Bekaa Valley with the approval of the Lebanese government. As for the Soviet social imperialists, as far as I can see from their deeds and their bombastic statements, it seems that they are doing nothing at all about these attacks that are occurring, about the attacks which are being made on the Palestinians and the Lebanese, or even about the attacks which are being made on the Syrians. Why do I say this? I say this because even though the Soviet Union has a, quote, treaty of friendship with Syria, it has played and is playing the role of the deaf and the blind. This is not the first time that the Soviet social imperialists have betrayed and left their, quote, Arab friends in the lurch. The Soviet social imperialists are interested, more than anything else, in selling them the maximum number of weapons so that they use them up as quickly as possible, and then buy more weapons, rather than in carrying out the pledges they make in the treaties of friendship which they sign with one country or another, and in engaging in open conflict with the American imperialists. Now there is more and more talk about a, quote, package political plan, said to be prepared and hatched up under the personal patronage of the American President Reagan for the settlement of the Middle East crisis. This plan does speak about the creation of a dismembered, quote, Palestinian state under the domination of the anti-Palestinian King of Jordan, but its main objective is to guarantee secure borders for Israel. This is the third installment in the achievement of the aims of Israel, American imperialism, and Arab reaction for the dispersal of the Palestinian people and the sabotage of their just struggle. Our people have special sympathy for the Palestinian people because they have waged and are waging a resolute and heroic fight, and we have supported and will go on supporting them in the ocean of loneliness and betrayal in which they find themselves today. Even though betrayed and abandoned as the Palestinian people are today, they will triumph. They will triumph for they are fighting for a just cause, for their return to their homeland usurped by the Israeli aggressors with the open support of the American imperialists, the Soviet social imperialists, and the reactionary forces of various Arab countries. The crisis in the Middle East can never be solved until the martyred Palestinian people regain their homeland stolen from them by the Israeli aggressors, and this will be achieved only when the political, economic, and military influence of the superpowers and the other imperialist powers has been dealt powerful blows and been totally rejected by all the Arab peoples. In this sense, this year showed that the primary question which faces the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people, the Afghan people, the Iranian people, and all the other Arab and non-Arab peoples of the Middle East is to avoid falling again into the traps and the misleading and disruptive plots of the superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and Israel. They must establish and strengthen genuine unity among themselves in order to resist and overcome the united forces of Israel, the American imperialists, the Soviet social imperialists, and the local feudal bourgeois reactionary circles. Only resolute, uncompromising struggle based on genuine Arab unity will lead them to victory, to true independence and freedom, so that they can utilize their colossal wealth, their oil, for their national development and social progress. And that is the end of the audiobook. What did you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. For my part, I wish that Hoxha was still around. I'd really be interested in picking his brain on a number of current topics, but I know that instead we just have to study and apply the principles of Marxism-Leninism, which is what he did. Alright, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, and they're also materially helpful. They allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without it. This channel is non-commercial, viewer-supported. We don't run ads or sponsorships, so that support is vital. Thanks to everybody who has contributed over the years, as well as currently. I really appreciate it a lot. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that helps to boost this content and the channel, whether it's on YouTube, Patreon, SoundCloud, Spotify, or Substack, wherever this has been posted, helping other people to stumble across it more easily. Beyond that, while you can do agitation and education online, organization is the final part that occurs in your local area. Get in touch with your local left network, whether it's in your city or if you're in a more rural place, maybe your county, state, or region. Find out what's going on, see what you can participate in, network with people, and find ways to intensify class struggle constructively. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.